Okay, we are recording.
Good morning or evening, as the case may be. Welcome to this half-day virtual conference on the costs and consequences of war, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan. I am Linda Yar, a research professor here at the Elliott School of International Affairs and Director of Partnerships for International Strategies in Asia, a program of the Sigur Center for Asian Studies. When she heard we were planning this conference, a friend, Dr. Dorothy Remy, alerted me to a particularly prescient poem, The End and the Beginning, by Wisława Szymborska, a Polish Nobel Prize winner. Two stanzas, the first and the penultimate, speak to what we will consider today. They read, "After every war, someone has to clean up. Things won't straighten themselves up after all." And the second stanza, "Those who knew what was going on here must give way to those who knew little, and less than little, and finally, as little as nothing." We hope that the discussions this morning shed light on the ongoing price that we continue to pay for wars conducted over the past 70 years. This conference would not be possible without the generous material and staff support of the Sigur Center for Asian Studies and the Chino Cienega Foundation. I also thank Rebecca Russell and Nora Hefferman for their assistance in organizing this event. We are also deeply grateful for our other co-sponsors, the Leadership, Ethics, and Practice Initiative of the Elliott School, the GW Institute of Korean Studies, the Elliott School of International Affairs, the National Committee on North Korea, and the Vietnam Peace Commemoration Committee. I'm delighted that Professor Christopher Kogan has agreed to serve as moderator for this first session. He is director of LEAP, as I mentioned, the Leadership, Ethics, and Practice Initiative at the Elliott School. He rejoined the school as Professor of Practice in International Affairs after serving as chairman of the National Intelligence Council from 2009 to 2014. He is also the director of the U.S. Foreign Policy Summer Program, and he taught previously at Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. In government, Chris served as a staffer in the House Foreign Affairs Committee under Representative Lee Hamilton, as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and as Deputy Director of the 9/11 Commission. He was president of the 9/11 Public Discourse Project, the Commission's follow-on public education organization, and served as a senior advisor to the Iraq Study Group. He received a master's degree in public affairs from Princeton University. Professor Kogan will introduce the panelists and conduct the this first session. Thank you very much, and we look forward to a lively and moving, I expect, debate. Thank you.
Well, Linda, thank you so much for that introduction. It's an honor and a privilege to be here on this important topic. We never, ever pay enough attention to the consequences and costs of our actions as a government when we embark on these wars and other policies. And so it's wholly fitting and proper that we're spending the morning today looking at this very important topic. And speaking of leadership, I want to thank you for yours in putting together today's program. Your leadership here has been essential to today's event. So let me turn to introductions of our four panelists here. I will do them in sequence here so as not to interrupt the discussion that will follow. And I will proceed in the order that our speakers will present. First, Ji-Young Lee. She is a political scientist who studies East Asian security at the intersection of history, area studies, and international relations. She is an associate professor of international relations and the C.W. Lim and K.F. Professor of Korean Studies at American University's School of International Service, our sister school. She is the author of China's Hegemony, 400 Years of East Asian Domination, and her current book project, The Great Power Next Door, is a historically informed analysis of when and how China has chosen to militarily intervene in the Korean Peninsula. Previously, she taught at Oberlin College and was a POSCO visiting fellow at the East-West Center, a non-resident James Kelly Korean Studies Fellow with the Pacific Forum CSIS, and a Korean Foundation Mansfield Foundation Scholar of the U.S. Korea Scholar Policymaker Nexus Program. Most recently, she served as the Korea Policy Chair and a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation. Let me introduce next Mr. Paul Morrow. He is a visiting assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Dayton with a cross-appointment in the university's Human Rights Center. His research focuses on legal and moral questions arising from war and mass violence. Earlier this year, Dr. Morrow and Human Rights Center Executive Director Shelley Inglis published a report entitled Coming to Terms with Legacies of the Vietnam War. Applying a transitional justice lens, this report examines the legacies of America's war in Vietnam and to assess what remains to be done. I'm also pleased to introduce my colleague, Benjamin Hopkins. He is the director of the Sigur Center for Asian Studies, which of course is sponsoring today's event. Ben is a historian of modern South Asia, specializing in the history of Afghanistan and British imperialism on the Indian subcontinent. He has authored, co-authored, and co-edited numerous books on the region. He has received fellowships from the Council on Foreign Relations, the National University of Singapore, the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, and the Wilson Center in DC. Writing for the public, he has been featured in the New York Times, the National Interest, and the BBC. He holds a PhD from the University of Cambridge and a BSc from the London School of Economics. And closing out our distinguished panel is Ms. Heidi Peltier. She is a senior researcher at Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs, and she is the director of programs for the Costs of War Project. She has been a contributing editor to the Costs of War Project since its inception in 2010 and joined the staff in 2019. She is an economist who has written on military-related topics, including the employment impacts of military and other public spending, military contracting, or what she calls the camo economy, and other areas at the intersection of militarism and public finance. She has also written widely on the employment impacts of a transition to a low-carbon economy and is the author of the book, Creating a Clean Energy Economy, How Investments in Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Can Create Jobs in a Sustainable Economy. So we have a very distinguished panel here. Without further ado, we'll proceed in the order that our panelists have introduced. So let's begin, please, with Ji-Young Lee.
Thank you so very much for that kind introduction. Let me share my screen. I have prepared brief PowerPoint presentation. Thank you so much for this kind invitation. Thank you to the organizers at the Sigur Center and everyone for joining this morning. When Linda invited me to this panel talking about consequences of war, I really felt that in the field of international relations, we do not really talk enough about human factor, the fact that war takes human lives, that really makes war, perhaps the most barbarous of all human affairs. So I was very much excited that, George Washington University, our sister school, is hosting this event. But at the same time, that's not necessarily my research area. So I was talking to her, but she convinced me that I can talk about what I do for research, which is looking at the war, basically the international relations of the Korean Peninsula from a big picture perspective. So what I decided to do is actually to start with the term geopolitics. In this presentation, I use the term simply to mean the study of the way a country's size, position, etc., influence its power and its relationship with other countries. This is from Cambridge Dictionary. So there can be many, many different things that we can talk about under this theme. But I thought what I could do is to show you some maps to situate the Korean War in the larger historical and international context, and then talk about China's relations between China and the Korean Peninsula today, thinking in terms of the war's consequences to this day. And then briefly, I would like to touch upon its implications for domestic politics within South Korea. This is the map of the Korean Peninsula, but this is actually made by the United States Office of Naval Intelligence Theater of Operations of the First Sino-Japanese War, Japan-China War, 1894-1895. So traditionally, when you look at international wars in Northeast Asia, Korean Peninsula actually has been the soil where wars took place. Geostrategically, from the Chinese perspective, Korean Peninsula becomes the bridge to the Asian mainland from any maritime power that has some ambition towards China. In the minds of Japanese strategists in early 20th century, Korean Peninsula is known as the dagger aimed at the heart of Japan. So this geostrategic situations becomes very salient, if you will, especially at times of great power competition surrounding the Korean Peninsula. This is a map that describes the situation in the beginning stages of the Korean War, published by Center of Military History, United States Army. So historically, Korean War is following a pattern where it was Korean Peninsula, is a historical zone of conflict in Northeast Asia, particularly at times of great power competition. And this map shows the three phases of the Korean War, and you can see the 38th parallel, that division of Korean Peninsula. This war basically placed South Korea and the United States, backed by the United Nations on the one hand, to fight against North Korea in PRC, as we well know. So the backdrop against which this war still has geopolitical consequences is such that the two Koreas, their division is consolidated throughout the years of the Cold War. In 1953, South Korea has military alliance with the United States, became part of US-led hub and spoke alliance system in Asia. North Korea in 1961 forms a military alliance with China, the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance, and competing against the US-led system together with Soviet Union, PRC, North Korea on the other side of that competition. So bringing our attention all the way to today's situation, let me highlight just a little bit about the relations between China and the Korean Peninsula today. One, because of these geopolitical circumstances, my first argument is that China is unlikely to take any actions to destabilize North Korea. When we understand the decision-making of Chinese policymakers at that time, which was immediately after the founding of PRC, you get to see how this logic of lip service that refers to China's historical vulnerability with regard to Korea's geographical location, as from Chinese perspective as a conduit from and to other great powers is very much at play. So throughout the Cold War period and the post-Cold War to this day, one can argue that Beijing's continued engagement with North Korea, despite occasional international criticisms against Beijing for refusing to, for example, put pressure on North Korea to change its behavior when it comes to North Korea's development of nuclear and missile development capability. Beijing, throughout history, and because of the Korean War's consequences, prioritized status quo and stability more than any other goals when it comes to North Korea. So Beijing's relations with North Korea really is a form of insurance to keep its influence on matters related to the Korean Peninsula. And this becomes much more salient, especially when China is in competition with other great powers, such as the United States today, and to a degree with Japan. I wanted to share with you a document that Ming China in the late 16th century, when Japanese forces invaded Korea in an attempt to conquer then Ming China, Ming Empire, you get to find this logic at play, which is similar to Chinese decision to intervene in the Korean War. It says, Joseon, Korea is geographically located under our arm to the east. Pyongyang is adjacent to the Yalu River to the west. If Japan, after taking over Joseon, Korea, were to train the Koreans as soldiers under its command and to bring military supplies from Korea to build a powerful military force against us, this could lead to an attempt to take over the Liaodong from Korea's Jeolla and Gyeongsang provinces. Then Beijing will fall into a dire situation without our enemy having reached us. This is a big worry for our security. Second, from a big picture perspective, South Korea's relations with China to this day remain primarily commercial and economic in nature. This has a lot to do with the earlier point that I made, remarkable continuity that we get to witness in China's North Korea policy, really because of North Korea's location. So it is interesting to note that China and South Korea did not normalize their diplomatic relations until after the end of the Cold War in 1992. And when you study why that was the case, Chinese policymakers were very much, trying very hard not to upset North Koreans, basically. And even after the 1992 diplomatic normalization, these two countries, Seoul and Beijing's attempt to upgrade their bilateral strategic ties have repeatedly faced unmet expectations. So they do promise for strategic partnerships, for example, but at crucial moments, China's interest in North Korea wanting stability and status quo always has priority over other goals when it comes to its relations with South Korea. So Beijing's engagement and economic coercion vis-a-vis South Korea similarly has its eyes on other great powers to prevent South Korea to become a force multiplier, a term that US policymakers have used as part of US alliance system in Asia. Since I am running out of time, I will make it very quick for the remaining parts of my presentation. So as you can see, this situation puts South Korea in a very difficult dilemma situation with China and the United States, especially with US strategy to decouple from China when China is South Korea's top trading partner. Even amongst US top key US allies, Australia, Japan, South Korea, when you look at their trade surplus with China as their percentage of GDP, South Korea's economic dependence on China is higher than that of Australia and Japan. So as United States competition with China intensifies, from Chinese point of view, Beijing's policy towards Seoul is more conditioned by its relations with the United States and has recently used economic coercion to leverage South Korea's national security decision over its decision to deploy US anti-missile system THAAD in South Korea. From South Korean perspective, there is a great deal of difficulty because of the need to cooperate with China on unification and denuclearization. And because of this geographical location, South Korean understanding of sensitivity towards China's interests sometimes has brought about very difficult alliance management questions with Washington. I actually had a few more slides, but in the interest of time, why don't I actually stop here? And if anyone has any further question about domestic politics and any further details pertaining to my earlier point, I will be happy to answer any questions. Thank you so very much.
All right, thank you, Ji-Young Lee. Thank you very much. And we'll go to our next presenter, Mr. Paul Morrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher, and thank you, Ji-Young, for that great contextualization of geopolitics around the Korean Peninsula. I'm going to share my screen here. I was delighted to hear from Linda and have the opportunity to present some of this research that we've been doing at the Human Rights Center at the University of Dayton, because this research in a way started at another conference that Linda and the Elliott School organized in 2019 around the 50th anniversary of the breaking of the story of the My Lai massacre in 1969. And so the work that we've been doing at the Human Rights Center around Vietnam War legacies has been supported by a number of organizations and other people doing work on the ground. We ourselves take a human rights and transitional justice-based approach to thinking about these questions. And although I use the phrase counting the costs here, I suspect that Heidi, as an economist, will actually do a lot more counting of costs of war in her presentation. But for my purposes, I'm going to focus on three big areas of legacy. Physical costs of war and those continuing costs today, social costs of war at the time as they were understood and continuing today, and then moral costs of war. And I am a philosopher, so that language comes more naturally perhaps than some of the social scientists in the room, but I'll try to justify that language of moral costs of war at the end. So briefly, I don't have a map to show, but I do have a brief timeline. I know this will be familiar to some of you, but less so to others. So in 1945, at the very end of the Second World War, September 2nd, Ho Chi Minh made a declaration of independence for Vietnam. I've just shared this with students in one of my philosophy classes, along with the US Declaration of Independence, and they were surprised to find that the Vietnamese Declaration cites the US Declaration of Independence, as well as the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. This was an attempt to get the United States, as the sort of arbiter of what the post-war world might look like, to decline to restore France as the colonizing power in Indochina, but that did not happen. And so the conflict known as the First Indochina War broke out very quickly in 1946 and continued until the Geneva Accords in the mid-1950s. Those accords were supposed to provide an electoral path for determining the political shape of North and South in Vietnam, but that did not happen. And so quickly this geographical division emerged. In 1961, President Kennedy first made the choice to send US military and advisors and equipment to Vietnam to support the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam. In 1962, there was a first use of chemical defoliants in Vietnam via Operation Ranch Hand. This was an attempt to provide a way of getting rid of the cover from vegetation for people moving from north to south along the Vietnamese peninsula. Gulf of Tonkin resolution in 1964, following a incident at sea offshore that was widely debated as to whether it was a legitimate incident or not. And you can look at Robert McNamara's statements in the late 1990s, suggesting that perhaps there was a legitimate incident, but then the one that actually gave rise to this resolution was a covert or faked incident. But this was the incident that allowed Congress to authorize President Lyndon Johnson to take all necessary measures in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia more broadly. And that was really the start of what the timeline of US involvement in a military conflict in Vietnam usually looks like. Peak of US troop deployment in Vietnam came in 1968, 1969, when there were more than 500,000 troops in Vietnam. In that same period, the Tet Offensive, or the New Year's Offensive by the North Vietnamese armies, stunned observers from the United States looking at the progress of the conflict because major incursions were made into the South. And the massacre of hundreds of civilians by US troops at My Lai took place. Again, that was not disclosed until Seymour Hersh's reporting a year later. A couple more milestones here. The invasion of Cambodia by US and South Vietnamese forces in 1970, along with domestically in the US, the shootings at Kent State and at Jackson State. 1973, the Paris Peace Accords ended US military involvement in Vietnam officially, and then shortly thereafter, 1975, the fall of Saigon, the end of the Republic of Vietnam, and there had been large-scale migration before, but a real surge of migration right in 1975 and also through much of the following decade from Vietnam to the Philippines and ultimately, in many cases, to the United States. This timeline could go on to the present, but I've ended it for space reasons in 1982 when the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was inaugurated in Washington, D.C. I should note for some of the consequences discussion, diplomatic relationships between Vietnam and the US were normalized in 1995. And we've just had the 25-year anniversary of that. So first, thinking about physical costs, costs that were well understood by people at the time of the conflict in the US for US young soldiers and people who were being drafted into the conflict. We have members of the Vietnam Peace Commemoration Committee here, and many of them may have been present at the moratorium where this armband was worn in 1969. And this is recognizing deaths from the conflict. So the official count, I believe, today is 58,220 American soldiers killed in that period from 1964 through 1975. There's estimates for the number of Vietnamese soldier and civilian deaths. That category of distinction between soldiers and civilians was not always upheld. Estimates around 3.3 million deaths during the period of the US conflict, so 1964 to 1973 or 75, depending how you're counting. This is a stamp pointing to the Russell Tribunal, which was an attempt in the international community to call attention to US war crimes in Vietnam, a stamp issued by North Vietnam. And many more war-related fatalities in Laos and Cambodia. The estimates and the counts are a little bit less clear in those cases. Along with fatalities, there's also non-fatal casualties from the conflict and in the period after the conflict. So again, an official count from the Veterans Administration says 150,000 US soldiers were hospitalized during the war with non-fatal wounds. There were others who were wounded but didn't have to be hospitalized in about equal numbers. And today, thousands and perhaps tens or hundreds of thousands dealing with the ongoing effects of limb loss, traumatic brain injury, and dioxin or Agent Orange associated illnesses today. Just last year in the Defense Authorization Act, a couple more illnesses were added to the presumptively Agent Orange or dioxin related list, but there remain other conditions where there's strong advocacy to include those as dioxin related. In Southeast Asia, millions of Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians wounded during the war, and millions more dealing with post-war wounds and disabilities rising from unexploded ordnance, or UXO, and dioxin, including large numbers of children. Again, here, there are different numbers that you encounter. So the Vietnamese government will say up to 4.8 million Vietnamese are dealing with disabilities arising from dioxin specifically. Others, like Charles Bailey, estimate this somewhere between 600 and 900,000 in Vietnam, with more in Laos and Cambodia. I should say there are 40,000 deaths from unexploded ordnance since 1975. So these are bombs, often cluster munitions, that did not explode at the time that they were dropped, but have since exploded and killed people, and many more people have been wounded grievously by unexploded ordnance. I think in the second session today, we might hear a little bit about attempts to remediate both dioxin and unexploded ordnance. So moving from those physical costs to thinking more broadly of social costs of the conflict. Well, some of those social costs, which I believe Heidi might speak to at the end of today's first session, were well understood at the time. So civil rights leaders, including Shirley Chisholm, Martin Luther King, Julian Bond, they all spoke to the fact that wartime spending on munitions, on soldiers, on aid to the Republic of Vietnam's army, was displacing social spending in the US, and that this was having a serious effect on social programs in the US around poverty reduction, around improving cities, around improving education in the United States. A different kind of social cost, but one that remains with us today as well, is enduring distrust amongst Vietnamese Americans towards the current government of Vietnam. There are significant generational differences in the way that Vietnamese Americans regard the Republic of Vietnam, but the oldest generation, those who have memories of the conflict or those who have memories of flight as refugees or re-education experiences, to this day have strongly, in many cases, hostile opinions towards the government of Vietnam. And as with other diasporic communities, this can lead to domestic challenges for how the US regards Vietnam as an international strategic and economic partner. I've already mentioned this. Hundreds of acres of agricultural land has been left uncultivated in Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia due to dioxin and UXO contamination. I believe you're having a presentation from the War Legacies Project, but there are other organizations from Peace Trees to the Project Renew that do work in Vietnam to try to certify that acres of land has been cleared of unexploded ordnance so that it can be brought back into cultivation, or so houses can be built and other uses made. And then a major issue since the end of the war, the issue of missing in action soldiers. So today, 2021, more than 1,000 American soldiers are recognized by the Defense POW Accounting Agency as still missing in action. Their remains have not yet been recovered. And a much larger number, more than 200,000, and by some estimates, more than 300,000 Vietnamese soldiers, both North and South, whose remains have not been recovered from the conflict. And I believe it was last year, the Department of Defense in the US signed an agreement with the Vietnamese military to provide support in the forensic technologies and procedures used to identify human remains, to try to bring closure to those families, a major sort of human rights issue, having the remains of one's loved one identified. And finally, I want to talk briefly about moral costs, and then briefly make the transition to thinking about transitional justice here, because that's the frame we've used in our research. First, this is a cost that is more recognized today than it was at the time, at least we have language for it, widespread struggles with moral injury amongst US veterans. That's a concept, moral injury, that is defined slightly differently by different psychologists, people working in this area, but it means roughly the harm to self that comes from performing actions that break deeply held moral norms. So killing in war, but also other kinds of actions in war can have this effect. I see that I'm close to my time limit, so I'm going to go quickly here. We see both Vietnam veterans at the time talking about this kind of injury. So Medal of Honor winner Gordon Roberts, who happened to go to my university after he served in Vietnam, made statements of this kind at the time. And then veterans from more recent wars, who in the case of Garrett Reppenhagen was the son of a Vietnam veteran, also speak to this concern and use this language of moral injury. Quickly, a couple other areas of moral costs of war. Viet Thanh Nguyen speaks eloquently about the failure to acknowledge wrongs suffered by those who became refugees and by ethnic minorities in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. That contributes to some of the social costs of the distrust of the government. And I'm happy to talk more in the Q&A about this. This has been widely reported over the last year, the sort of decline of military service as a routine part of American life, in part because of the ending of the draft as a way people entered the US military with the Vietnam War, appears to have created a lot of isolation, grievance, and at least the conditions for radicalization amongst veterans. And it speaks to the sort of 3% notion that very, very few Americans take up the call to serve the country, and therefore there are very few who are sort of really patriots. I will decline to go through my sort of transitional justice slide, but I'm happy to speak to that lens at the end, and I want to turn things over to Ben. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you so much, Paul. And yes, let's go directly to Ben Hopkins. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you, Linda, for organizing this event and for putting it together, as well as for the other sponsors of the event. I really want to pick up on Chris's opening remarks about your constant failure of the United States to really grapple with the costs and consequences of its overseas footprint, but also how that affects us domestically. And I know that Heidi will speak more in depth about that. The brief I've been given as a historian of Afghanistan is to talk about the war in Afghanistan and its lasting consequences. And I think the first thing we need to acknowledge is that that war, despite the pronunciation from the presidential podium of President Biden in mid-August, is not over. That war may be in hiatus, it may be over, it may not be over. But what we say at this point is that it is definitively over. Either for the United States, which continues its so-called over-the-horizon operations, which has already killed Afghan civilians in drone strikes, or for Afghans themselves, who are laboring under, I won't say the rule of the Taliban yet, because they really haven't established themselves as a government, but under the control of the Taliban, as it were, for the moment. As a historian, especially of the 19th century, and aware of the import, but also the politicization of statistical sciences, I do subscribe to the idea of there's lies, damn lies, and then there's statistics. And so I'll rather avoid those when talking about Afghanistan, because also when we look at the statistics for Afghanistan, for something as innocuous as population numbers, we really wade into a political minefield, no pun intended, which can distract as much as it can reveal. But I think there are some things that we need to note. And that is, despite the American framing of the war lasting 20 years, when we look at Afghanistan, we're not talking about a 20-year war. Rather, we're talking about a war that entered its 43rd year in April of this year. After all, in April 1978, the Sao Revolution, which brought the Afghan communists to power, was successfully executed. And the violence which continues in the country today is really a continuation of that original struggle which broke out in 1978. Clearly, there's been many chapters to that conflict. It's changed over time. But we need to recognize that for 43 years, this is a country that has been at war. When we superimpose that fact on the idea that the Afghan population is overwhelmingly young, the consequences for Afghanistan itself become really stark. The majority of the Afghan population was born after the American invasion in 2001, about 50, depending on what statistics you look at. And again, I treat those with skepticism. Anywhere between 51 to about 57% were born after 2001. If we go back to 1978, we're talking about approximately 3/4 of the Afghan population being born. So this is really a country where both individually but collectively, violence has been the key marker of their life experience. You know, and in many ways that is extraordinarily lasting and extraordinarily problematic. In talking about Afghanistan, I think it's really important for us to think for a couple of minutes about what the issues of the conflict in Afghanistan are. For when it's talked about in the United States, there's really a focus on the consequences of the 9/11 attacks, on the global war on terror, which Heidi will talk more about. And that has actually very little traction as a source of conflict within Afghanistan itself. So what is the source of conflict in Afghanistan? Has it been resolved? And if not, then what are the prospects for peace looking forward? Well, really the essential issue in the conflict in Afghanistan domestically is what I will call the Afghan political compact. Prior to the Sao Revolution, the communist takeover in 1978, we had an imperfect but nonetheless stable political compact that ruled out over Afghanistan, where you had a multi-ethnic, multi-confessional state, which was focused in the cities, which claimed authority over the countryside, but never exercised that authority because it knew in reality it couldn't. When the communists took over government in 1978 and then were buttressed by the Soviet intervention in 1979, you had a much more ambitious project which sought to assert state authority into the countryside. As a consequence, that durable political compact, which had seen Afghanistan as a land of relative quietude and peace through the majority of the 20th century, was essentially ripped up. And that is the lasting issue at the core of the violence in Afghanistan today, that there is no viable social and political compact upon which to construct and build the Afghan state. And for as much as the discussion about the failure of American efforts in the country revolve around Afghan corruption or the failure of the Afghan National Army, those kind of discussions really fail to grasp this central issue about the lack of a viable political compact in Afghanistan today. Do I think that the Taliban currently in control of Afghanistan are the party to, if not reconstruct that social compact, then build a new one? I do not. However, who will in turn be able to come up with that, I think remains unclear at this point. The other thing that I think we need to acknowledge when we look at Afghanistan, and again, this resonates with, in particular, the language of corruption, which I think is emerging in Washington as the main kind of post-mortem analysis that America failed in Afghanistan because of the corruption of Afghan political elites. I actually quite strongly disagree with that. And the reason for that is because the way the Afghan state operates, and in particular, its reliance upon a foreign subsidy, is not a sign of the failure of the Afghan state, as is so often cited in Washington today, but rather is actually a sign of the success of the Afghan state. And that's quite counterintuitive, so give me a moment to just explain that really quickly. When the Afghan state is constructed in the mid-19th century under the very watchful eye of the British Empire in India, the British realized that the return on investment, as it were, for actually controlling the Afghan lands was not worth the cost. And so rather than establishing a regime of control, the British sought to establish a regime of influence. And they did that by making Afghanistan financially dependent upon the British Indian Empire. In fact, they formalized this relationship in the Treaty of Gandamak in 1879, wherein they sent an annual subsidy in the form of a treasure train of 600,000 rupees per year. By the time of the Third Anglo-Afghan War in 1919, that subsidy had grown to 2.4 million rupees. What did the Afghan rulers use that subsidy for? Well, they used it to construct a state, and in particular, an army, because the quid pro quo, as it were, of this subsidy was that the Afghans would construct a security architecture which would keep the craziness, as it were, within the bounds of modern Afghanistan. Now, though the British withdrew from the South Asian subcontinent in 1947, this model of a subsidy state continued during the Cold War. However, it assumed the form of development aid, sponsored by the United States and by the Soviets respectively. Then, following the Soviet invasion in 1979, you have the direct Soviet intervention and the putting of the Afghan government on the Soviet payroll. After 2001, you effectively had the same situation. However, the paymaster became the United States. If we look at 2019's budget in Afghanistan, which is the last that's publicly available for the Ghani government, we see that out of a government budget of approximately $11 billion, $6 billion of that came in the form of direct grants in aid by foreign governments. So Afghanistan is reliant upon foreign largesse and subsidies, not because of the failure and incapacity of state structures, but because it was designed that way. Seeing time and wanting to be sure to give space for Heidi's very important presentation, I just really quickly want to finally turn to the theme of the conference today, and that is the costs of the war in Afghanistan. Now, as this war continues, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that on the one hand, we have costs that have already accumulated. But on the other hand, this is a dynamic situation where those costs continue moving forward. Heidi is going to give more numbers about that in terms of the continuing costs for the United States. But some of those that have been bandied about in the wake of the American withdrawal is the $2.2 trillion since 2001 that the United States has invested in the Afghan war, which inflation adjusted makes it the most expensive war in American history. We have the 2,500 approximately American service personnel who've been killed in Afghanistan. But what's less talked about are the 4,000 military contractors that have been killed in Afghanistan, which goes directly to the point of Heidi's camo economy, which I'm sure she'll bring up. And then we have something around 20,000 American service personnel injured. Now, our best guesstimate for Afghan casualties is around 140,000, but I would emphasize that as a floor. Afghan casualties weren't even counted until around 2010. So in reality, we have very little idea of the personal cost of the war to Afghans themselves. There's also the environmental cost that we need to recognize, that Afghanistan has been marred by 43 years of war. Many of the issues Paul brought up about unexploded ordnance, the leftovers of war, remain scarring the Afghan countryside, be it anti-personnel landmines, which were dropped en masse by the Soviets, or the leftovers of American ordnance strewn throughout the country. This is a country that's largely been remade physically by the markings of war, but it's an effect that has, something that has effects outside the confines of Afghanistan itself. For instance, the Peshawar Valley in northern Pakistan has been home to an enormous population of Afghan refugees, by some estimates up to 3 million over that 43-year period, and that has had lasting negative effects on the environment in northern Pakistan. So very wide-ranging consequences and cost in Afghanistan itself. Secondly, we need to think about the cost of the war to the international system, which the United States largely authored and has guaranteed since the end of the Second World War. Much has been made about the fact that Afghanistan represents the second war the United States has lost, of course, after Vietnam. Very little has been made about the fact that this is the first war NATO has lost. It's actually the first war that NATO has been a legal belligerent in, as it declared the attack of September 11th on September 12th as an attack on the alliance itself. So what is the effect of the loss of the war going to be on NATO and on American prestige abroad? We can see some of that, for instance, with the Chinese trolling the Taiwanese in the aftermath of the American withdrawal, saying, if the Americans will not stand by Afghanistan, you can be sure that the Americans will not stand by you. I think there's a legitimate question of the current buildup of Russian forces on the Ukrainian frontier might in fact be in part a consequence of Putin making an assessment that America is not the reliable ally. And thus perhaps it's time for a revisionist power like Russia to flex its muscles. And then of course, there are the effects and costs of the war on the United States. I don't want to go into those because I don't want to steal Heidi's thunder, but I do want to make 2 points about that. The first is that a generational war has generational costs. And that is something we have not articulated, much less recognized, much less come to grips with. And I would finish with a quotation from George Marshall, who was the chief of the Army during the Second World War, and then, of course, became the Secretary of State under the Truman administration. Having served as the logistical chief of the war effort during the Second World War, he made a very interesting observation in 1946, and it was this. Marshall said that a democracy cannot survive a 7 years war. Assuming that the United States has successfully exited the war in Afghanistan, the United States has just ended a 20-year war. What is the cost of that? Surely it's more than $2 trillion and 2,500 dead. And with that, I turn it over to my colleague, Heidi.
All right, thank you so much, Ben. And let's move directly to Ms. Heidi Peltier. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. And thanks for that setup, Ben. Thanks to the organizers and other panelists and the attendees today. I'm going to pull up some slides. Let's get this going. Okay, so I'll talk today about the costs and consequences of the post 9/11 wars, focusing mainly on the budgetary costs and consequences, but also the human costs. And I'll supplement some of what's been talked about already by Paul and Ben in particular. So just to kind of lay the stage to set the stage for the past 70 or so years of defense spending. So looking from 1947 up until last year, you can see this massive increase. This is both the Department of Defense and then also other defense spending that happens, for example, in the Department of Energy for nuclear programs. So I've highlighted a couple of data points, 2001 and 2020, and you can see that spending more than doubled over the past 20 years, reaching almost $900 billion in defense spending last fiscal year. So focusing on the cost of the wars since 2001, this graphic here comes from a paper by Nita Crawford, who is the co-director of the Cost of War Project. And this paper was released on September 1st of this year. And I'll make this presentation available. There are links to the paper in it. And what this does is kind of add up not only the most narrow definition of war spending that we hear from the Department of Defense, but all the other types of spending that really are attributable to war. So if we look at this kind of brick red segment, the DoD OCO, that's $2.1 trillion. That's the piece that we most often hear talked about by the Department of Defense as what they have spent on the war. And this is the narrowest definition of war spending. So OCO stands for Overseas Contingencies Operations. It used to be called the Global War on Terror. It's a line item in the federal budget, that is considered supplemental or emergency, and so it hasn't been subject to the same sorts of budgetary constraints like the budget caps through sequestration and so on. And so this is what's known as the war budget, 2.1 trillion, plus a little bit of OCO in the State Department. But in addition to that, we can look at the Pentagon budget in peacetime compared to wartime. And if we look at the difference over the past 20 years of what the Pentagon has spent compared to what it would have spent in peacetime, we get this bottom section, kind of teal colored, increases to the base. So that's the Pentagon's budget, the difference between its wartime budget and peacetime budget. So putting that together with the war spending, the OCO spending, we get nearly $3 trillion spent by the Department of Defense over the past 20 years. And then we can also look at the increased cost of Homeland Security, because part of what the War on Terror did was create this, the notion of fighting terror and both going abroad to fight terror and also protecting Americans from terrorists. And so the Department of Homeland Security was established in 2003, and over the past 20 years, more than $1 trillion have been spent on Homeland Security at the federal level. That doesn't include any state or local spending on Homeland Security or policing or anything like that. Then we have this green segment of the pie, veterans care, and this is only what has been spent so far on veterans care and benefits for post 9/11 vets. That doesn't include any future obligations, which I'll get to in a minute. But veterans care and benefits, about $465 billion have already been spent to date. And then the last segment of the pie here is the interest cost. So one of the things that's exceptional about the post 9/11 wars is that they have been funded entirely through debt. So whereas in the Korean War and the Vietnam War, taxes were increased, war bonds were sold, taxes on the wealthiest in particular were dramatically increased. The difference in the post 9/11 wars is that during the George W. Bush administration, taxes on the wealthiest were decreased. So America went into deficit spending, and the wars, rather than being paid for by increased taxes or by war bonds, were paid exclusively through debt. And so that entails interest cost. And if we look at the interest costs that have accrued already over the past 20 years, that's more than $1 trillion. And these will continue to accrue. We will continue to be paying interest on the debt as long as the debt is outstanding, which it will be for some time. And then, so if we add together this entire pie, we get $5.8 trillion. 5.8 trillion is what has already been spent over the past 20 years. And then if you look at the chart, this plus sign over here, plus over 2.2 trillion in obligations for veterans care and benefits over the next 30 years. So this comes out of work from Linda Bilmez, who's at Harvard, and she has written for the Cost of War project, and her paper came out in late August of this year, looking at what we have spent to date and what we will be spending over the next 30 years for the medical care of veterans, for disability benefits, and for other benefits. And she finds that between 2.5 and between 2.2 and 2.5 trillion, we will be obligated to spend over the next 30 years. So that brings the total spending for the post 9/11 wars to $8 trillion or more over the past 20 years and future costs. So I want to put this in context with the Korean War and Vietnam War, and I don't have expertise in those wars. What I found was a Congressional Research Service report looking at the cost of the wars, and so the downside of this was the last time that this report was written was more than 10 years ago, or 10 years ago. It came out in 2011. No, excuse me, 2010. And so this puts in context the Korean, Vietnam, and post 9/11 wars, and the post 9/11 wars, you can easily double the figures that are here. So looking at the rightmost column, constant dollars, inflation adjusted dollars, you can see 341 billion for the Korean War, twice as much, more than twice as much for the Vietnam War, excuse me, and then as of 2010, the post 9/11 wars were already over $1 trillion, but we can see from the previous statistics, it's much higher than that now. Looking at casualties, so this chart is fatalities, and this comes from Nita Crawford and Kathy Lutz. This was published on September 1st of this year, looking at the human toll of the post 9/11 wars, and this focuses on direct deaths, and I'll talk about indirect deaths in a minute. But you can see by column, it breaks it out into war zones, and by line, the types of casualties, the types of fatalities. So the U.S. military total is about 7,000 fatalities. U.S. contractors actually outnumbers that, about 8,000. I'm not going to talk much about the work I've done on the camo economy, but I've done some work on military contracting, and one of the reasons I call it the camo economy is because there's a camouflaging of how many U.S. Personnel are at war, and a camouflaging of how many deaths. We hear about the military deaths, but there's very little public attention to the contractor deaths. And in this case, over the past 20 years, contractor deaths have outnumbered military deaths. The greatest numbers of casualties are the national military and police, the opposition fighters, and most notably civilians. So out of these 900,000 or so total fatalities, more than a third of those are civilians. So by far the greatest number of deaths here are the civilian deaths. And as I mentioned, these are just direct deaths. So what this doesn't count is the indirect death. And we know that indirect deaths are many times the number of direct deaths. So indirect deaths happen, for example, when healthcare facilities are bombed and people cannot access healthcare and die from other illnesses, injuries, disease. When food and water supplies are compromised by conflict, leading to starvation and dehydration and disease and so on. And so getting an exact number on indirect deaths is very difficult, but we know it is a factor of direct deaths, that it is many times. So somewhere in the millions is what we can count the total fatalities from the post 9/11 wars. So looking at the ongoing presence and the ongoing costs, again, the veterans care and benefits, most of the costs lie ahead. I'd refer you to Linda Bilmez's paper if you want to look at the details there, but veterans costs and the future veterans costs are much more expensive than was originally anticipated, partly because the wars lasted so much longer, partly because veterans are actually accessing that care and benefits at greater rates than they had in the past, and then partly because the injuries are more severe, but also more survivable. So there are many more highly disabled veterans accessing care and disability benefits. Other costs that will increase in the future are the interest payments. So there's a paper I wrote in 2020 that looks at the cost of what we will be paying in interest, or what we could be paying in interest. And if you look at the Congressional Budget Office, they predict that by 2030, the U.S. federal government is going to be spending 10% of all its expenditures on interest. That's both for war debts and other debt. So that's 10% of U.S. federal spending that will be used on interest rather than in productive investments. If we look at the global presence, the counterterrorism operations that have been justified by this notion of going abroad to fight terrorism before it comes to the U.S., that those counterterrorism operations have expanded now to over 85 countries, or at least 85 countries. And there's a great map by Stephanie Savell looking at the global presence of the U.S. So the cost of wars may decrease in some categories. For example, the war budget, the narrow definition, the OCO budget. But payments will continue for veterans, payments will continue for interest, and DoD spending itself, which interest in veterans, those are different line items in the budget. The DoD itself is expected to increase its expenditures over the next few years. And now that the global war on terror, the post 9/11 wars, are not the justification for this increased defense spending, other things are coming into play to justify increased defense spending. Claims of Chinese aggression, the buildup toward China, weapons modernization, nuclear expansion, all of these are reasons why the Department of Defense budget is expected to keep rising over the next 5 years, even with the end of the, or supposed end of the post 9/11 wars. Just to close out a little bit with the ongoing presence in Korea, Vietnam, and the post 9/11 wars. So in Korea, there are about 73 bases. This is as of July of this year, 73 bases and over 26,000 troops. The budgetary cost for this is about $4 billion a year. And there are a little over 1 million living veterans who served in the Korean War, U.S. veterans. In Vietnam, the stationing of troops is minimal, but there are thousands in the area, and there are over 6 million living veterans who served in Vietnam. The post 9/11 wars, the exact number of ongoing presence of the troops is not exactly known because some of these numbers are not as of the past few years, they're not made public anymore. But we know that there are at least 2,500 troops still in Iraq, over 2,000 in Kuwait, and unpublished estimates in the area. We know that there are at least 4 million veterans, and that number continues to grow as this presence continues, and that the cost will reach well over $2 trillion by 2050. And as I mentioned, the interest cost will continue and will grow. So I'll end there. I'll provide this list of resources. These are the papers from the Cost of War project that I referred to, as well as some other publications that give the data that I mentioned in today's presentation. And I will end there, and thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you so much, Heidi, for that very powerful presentation. Thank you to all the presenters for excellent presentations, getting us set up for the questions, and we'll turn directly to them and utilize the time that we have. So let me start with a question from Andrew Wells-Dang from the U.S. Institute of Peace, and the question is for Paul. Paul, you mentioned distrust of the Vietnamese government as well as distrust of the U.S. government as a cost of war. What do you think can be done now to increase trust?
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Andrew, for the question. And for those who don't know, Andrew is involved in a project of stepping up some education and commemoration around the Vietnam War in the United States. I'm going to link our full report in the comment section here at the chat, because we do have some discussion of what we call sort of hidden histories, or histories of the conflict that have not been sufficiently aired both in the US and in Vietnam. When you talk to Vietnamese Americans, especially of the 1975 generation, we talked to our local community here in Dayton, but we only have about 5,000 to 7,000 Vietnamese Americans here. There's many, many more in California and also in the Washington, D.C. area. One thing that you hear is this nation of the Republic of Vietnam, which sort of in temporal terms existed for about 30 years, something like that, a little less than 30 years, has no really public commemoration or public memory, right, except in their communities, because in the United States, most people don't have any memory of this independent nation existing, or if they have a memory, it's of stories of sort of corruption of the leaders of that country or of the military defeat of that country. And in Vietnam today, even the idea of a division between North and South Vietnam is not really something that's talked about. There is no sort of public memory for South Vietnam in Vietnam. So in the oldest generation, there's a sense that there needs to be some sort of public way of commemorating or making their memories valid. I showed a slide of a memorial that was dedicated here in Dayton right before the pandemic to the fall of Saigon, right? So it was a memorial for, I believe, April 30th, right? And I suspect that that sort of commemorative activity will continue over the next couple of years, because we're coming up to the 50th anniversary of that event in 1975. You know, how can there be legitimate sort of public airing of some of these memories without creating tensions and other dimensions? I recommend a graphic novel, actually, especially for those working with young people. There's an excellent graphic novel called The Best We Could Do by a young graphic novelist named Thi Bui, who is herself second generation Vietnamese American, or in fact, she has a very young memory. So she's maybe 1.5 generation is how we might describe her, right? She came to the United States as a refugee as a very young child and doesn't really have much direct memory of that. But she talks about her parents, their experience of being refugees, their experience in a sort of diasporic community in very eloquent terms. The other side of it, the distrust for the US government, that might be a separate question, so I don't want to take up too much time, but I also have thoughts about that, and there's some discussion of that in our report as well. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Paul. And I have a question which is really, I think, open for everyone here, and that's from Gordon Adam. And it's, can someone speak to the consequences of these three wars for the way the United States engages or has engaged with the rest of the world? Can we recognize that militarization of U.S. engagement and the U.S. assumption of indispensability has corrupted and distorted U.S. foreign policy going forward? And what are the lessons learned for us at the strategic level? So that's for any of our panelists who wish to take the question.
I mean, I can hop in, Chris, as I think I did address this at the end of my presentation about the after effects of the American withdrawal from Afghanistan. When the U.S. withdrew in August, it took its NATO allies by surprise, and it also forced the issue because, frankly, the United States provides the logistical backbone for NATO. So when the United States decided it was getting out, it decided without great consultation with its NATO allies. We could see immediately, as I said, the Chinese trolling the Taiwanese about that. I think you can see it with how Russia is acting towards Ukraine. But I also think that there are questions, this happens in a context that we come off an administration that was cold towards NATO. So even though the Biden administration is saying America's back, if this is the way that America's back to its NATO allies, then its NATO allies might have significant questions about that. I think more broadly, the United States has been the guarantor of an international order since 1945, politically, morally, as Paul has talked about, economically, as Heidi has talked about, and these wars have had profound effects. The political cost is clear. The moral authority of the United States, when you have pictures of a C-17 with desperate Afghans holding on the outside trying to get out of Hamid Karzai International Airport, that does incalculable damage to American prestige internationally. But I also think that something we haven't recognized then is Heidi's point that we've become a debtor nation largely indebted not to our own people, because we have incurred debt to fight previous wars, but largely to American citizens through bond sales. Afghanistan has been 96% debt financed, and most of that debt financing is owned by overseas bondholders, in particular the Chinese government. So I think that has real profound, long-lasting implications that are working themselves out in real time.
All right. Would anyone else like to address that question?
I can speak briefly about this question from the perspective of the Korean Peninsula situation. Broadly speaking, US-ROK alliance is largely considered as a success case in the sense that there hasn't been war since the Korean War. So there's that, bright side of that alliance. But then what the United States policymakers are learning throughout these years of, alliance management efforts is that, United States focus on Cold War strategy, really created the seeds for anti-American sentiment later in the 1980s and on. And right now, what we call South-South divide within South Korea rests on the divided perceptions about North Korea regarding who North Korea is to South Koreans, but also it is tied to South Korean perception and identity towards United States. Part of the history, which I do not have time to get into, is during the Cold War years, the idea that many progressives in South Korea share that United States tacitly supported the authoritarian leaders who were utilizing North Korea as a way to buttress their dictatorship. That really became the huge kind of focal point of South Korean perception later, anti-American sentiments in the 1980s. Yeah, so it's really this dynamics of the past dependence. You know, it probably was that decision to intervene in Korea that later led to the alliance, but as international circumstances change, alliance actually has been transformed depending on responding to changes in international circumstances, which really speaks to how military alliance actually has many different legs or layers, if you will. So it's very difficult to say anything about US-RK alliance in a definitive term. Yeah, we often think about the alliance in a military sense, but there are many other aspects that people have looked into and actually needs to be brought into more public attention.
That's a very important perspective. So thank you, Ji-young. And unfortunately, we're out of time for this wonderful panel, and I'm going to pass it back to Linda Yar.
Thank you so much, Chris, for moderating this outstanding discussion, and to our speakers for taking us painfully through these unacknowledged, unrecognized consequences and costs of the wars we've engaged in for the last 70-some years. I am hopeful that we can turn to our second session, where we will meet people who representing organizations that are working on the ground as we speak to mitigate these harms of war that we've learned about today. Thank you so much, Heidi Peltier, Chris Kojam, Ben Hopkins, Paul Morrow, and Ji-young Lee for an outstanding session. And we look forward to meeting the attendees in the next session, which needs to be opened shortly. Thank you.
Thank you.